And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with something I haven't really done very much before at all yet, and hopefully I'll do a lot more. And that is today I'm doing an explicit video on what I just consider to be some of my random thoughts. It's going to be relatively unstructured, I don't have a script or anything like that, but this is something that I have thoughts about, and everything that I will do a random thoughts video about will be something that I've thought about a fair bit. So hopefully this will be interesting, even if you don't agree with it, and hopefully it'll be kind of clear. Um, so what I want to talk about today really is a concept that I personally consider or label as retrospective recontextualization. Now, I am well aware that sounds really pretentious, so that's not going to be what I put in the title of this video. I'll probably call this video something like twist endings versus shock endings or something like that, because that's probably the first easy handle there is to start to grasp what I'm talking about. Before I jump into it, there's going to be a whole bunch of spoilers that I'm going to talk about in this video for various movies, various comics, maybe some video games, that sort of thing. I'll put a list of them on the screen here. If you're really, really sensitive about spoilers on any of these things, then stop watching the video in like a minute's time. Because I'll just go full into spoilers at that point and just talk about all these things as if you've seen them and as if you're familiar with them. But if you don't want to see those spoilers, then all I'm just going to say is really quickly what this video is talking about is kind of the difference between a twist and a shock. So a twist ending is an ending where something happens or something is revealed in a comic, a video game, or a film, which completely flips everything on its head. So all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, they were dead the whole time, or they were actually on Earth the whole time, and it's not an alien planet, that sort of thing. A twist is something that where it happens at the end, it means that when you go back and you watch that movie for the second time, for example, you will never watch it in the same way because you'll be aware of the twist and it'll change everything about how you view what's happening in the story. Whereas a shock ending or a cliffhanger ending or something like that is just something unexpected that happens. But when it happens, it doesn't necessarily change everything that's happened beforehand. It's not like you'll watch that movie for the second time and be like, oh my God, this is all different. I realized that, he was an alien the whole time or X, Y, Z. It's not that at all. It's just a case of, oh, these events happen and then this shocking, unexpected event happens at the end. People tend to get these things confused a lot, and I think that's really kind of the core behind what I'm talking about when I talk about retrospective recontextualization. But listen, if you don't want spoilers, you need to drop out now. But if you don't mind me talking about spoilers about all the things I've just shown, I'm going to jump into a lot more detail about the concept I'm talking about for the rest of this video. Cool. Have they gone? If you haven't gone and you don't want spoilers, then it's at your own risk. So let me dive into some detailed examples of what I mean. So let's look at some things that are considered to be twist endings. I'm going to try to keep this in just groups of three because I think groups of three examples of each thing I talk about makes it much easier to handle, even though there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of everything I can think about. So for twist examples, the first thing I can think of is The Sixth Sense, the film by M. Night Shyamalan. And this movie came out in like what, 99, 2000, something like that. It's really famous, mainly because of the twist ending, in which it turns out that Bruce Willis, who is really the protagonist of the movie, turns out to have been a ghost the entire time. He's been dead for the entire movie. Once you realize that right at the end of the movie, then all of a sudden, like the movie, the next time you watch it, you'll be watching it completely differently. When you're watching it, you'll realize that no one's interacting directly with Bruce, and all these various other aspects of the way it's been filmed, the way it's been put together, is constantly hinting and teasing at you that this is the case. In other words, once you watch The Sixth Sense once, you will never watch it the same way the second time. But the second, and third, and fourth time, you will watch it kind of the same way because you know what the twist is, and it's forced you to review and reconsider everything that you watched the first time through this lens of new information. Twist example number two is The Usual Suspects. Again, came out round about the same area, early 2000s, I think. And in this movie, the twist is at the end that Kevin Spacey, who's the person doing this kind of retrospective interview or reminiscence of the events that are portrayed in the movie, it turns out that Kevin Spacey is actually Kaiser Soze. And once you find out that twist right at the end of the movie, in the very last scene, it means that when you go back and watch the movie, every scene feels different because all of a sudden you're aware of his agenda, you're aware of what's going on. You will never watch The Usual Suspects again the way you saw it the first time when you didn't know that twist was coming. Final example is Fight Club. Quite a famous twist here. Right at the end, you find out that Brad Pitt's character of Tyler Durden and Ed Norton's character of the nameless protagonist is the same person. It's a split personality multiple personality disorder scenario. And once you realize that, again, you go back, you watch the movie, and you notice all these subtle things. You notice that the character of Edward Norton never gives his name, for example. You'll notice the way that people interact with them is kind of subtly indicative of the fact that actually they're the same person's body with two personalities. And it's all very clever. Again, the next time you watch it, the second time, the third time, or fourth time you watch it, you'll never watch it with that fresh face lens of not knowing that twist is there. So those are three examples of twists in movies. So now let's look at examples of three shocks that are in movies. Let's start off with Seven. The movie Seven has a very shocking ending where Brad Pitt's wife is killed. Um, it's shocking the way that it's revealed with her head being in a box, etc., etc. The whole thing is just it's a massive shock. But the second time you watch Seven, it doesn't really change anything. It's not like you're watching it going, "Oh my God, Brad Pitt's the killer the whole time." That's not the case. He wasn't the killer the whole time. Like it is what it says on the tin. It's a psychological drama thriller horror movie, and then at the end there's a shocking ending. But it's not a twist. It doesn't force you to reevaluate it. The second time you watch Seven isn't much different than the first time you watch Seven, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth. Let's look at the movie Saw. You can see I'm keeping all this quite contemporary with my examples, but with the movie Saw, right at the end, you realize that the jigsaw killer is the dead body that's been lying on the ground the entire time throughout the movie. I'm talking about the first movie Saw. After that, the franchise massively descends. But in the first movie, the twist ending is that Jigsaw is lying on the floor between the two characters. But actually, it's not so much a twist, it's just a shock. Like, the fact that he's there and he's alive doesn't actually change anything about how you view the movie the second time or the third time. You're like, oh, it's clever, and I know that shock ending is coming, but it doesn't actually change the way you perceive the characters or the events or anything like that. It's just a shock ending. Last example of a shock ending here is Harry Potter. If you look at Harry Potter 6, loads of people were like, oh my God, the twist is that um, Snape kills Dumbledore. Oh my God, what a twist. It's like, that's not a twist. That's just a surprising development, isn't it? That, like that's just what happens. Like there were a series of events, and the last event was one that you didn't see coming because it was pretty extreme. Snape kills Dumbledore. That's not a twist at all. It doesn't recontextualize anything that you've read or watched previously. What was a twist was in the seventh book or the last couple of films, where it turns out that actually Snape was a good guy all along. That completely changes the previous books and the previous storylines and the way that you view that character. That's a twist. But the fact that he killed Dumbledore was just a shocking thing that he did. It's just a shocking part of the story. So there we have it. We have the difference between twists and we have the difference between shocks. And I know this seems like a pretty stupid and laborious thing for me to be highlighting, but it's really important because a lot of people keep on getting them mixed up. If you Google, top 10 movie twist endings, you'll get like a list which combines twists and shocks, which isn't really sensible or fair. Now, just for a second, I'm just going to just take a moment and just pause here. And I'll just say that what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this video is twist endings. But some of you will be watching this right now and thinking, but Thomas, like when you're saying twist endings, really what you're just talking about is what people call retcons. Retroactive continuity. Like what's this pretentious label you're making up for what's essentially just a retcon? And we all know what retcons are. It's where creators will change something and go, oh no, that wasn't actually the case. There's actually a different origin story or a different event happened. So DC continuity is riddled by retcons. Jay Garrick was initially the Flash because of this, but actually Wally West was struck by lightning, but actually it was this, but then actually it was that. And a retcon is basically when writers at a later point in the future, or I suppose the present, look back on the past and go, oh, this thing you thought happened? Yeah, no, we'll change it. Actually, Jason Todd didn't die. He was actually in a coma, and then Ra's al Ghul brings him back, or this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, yeah, you're just changing stuff in the past. You're changing it for the sake of it. That's all it is. That's what retcons are. I think, in my mind, the best way to look at a retcon was actually depicted in the movie Misery. I don't know if you've seen Misery. It's a movie from the 90s. It's based on the Stephen King book. And in that, there's a scenario where a particular character has written another character to be dead. Like they've died in the grave and they've been buried in a coffin. And then for various reasons, he is forced and obliged to continue the story. And so what he does is he rewrites it so that this person didn't die of whatever disease it was and they don't get buried. And the character of Kathy Bates, she absolutely loses her mind at this, and she's furious at this because she goes, "That's not fair." It's like when you watch a movie. This is the example she gives. It's like when you watch a movie, and a car goes over a cliff, and the hero's in the car, and the car bursts into flames. You're like, "Well, that's what's happened. This person's been caught in an exploding car. They're dead." And then in the next episode, it shows a car going over the cliff, and then this person resting the door handle and jumping out a moment before the car bursts into flames. And in her insane way, she makes a very sensible point that that's not fair. That's cheating. That's not what actually happened. The writer's gone back and they've changed events to give themselves a loophole. And that's what retcons are. That's what retroactive continuity changes are. When they go back and they say things like, "Oh, Jason died, but actually Ra's al Ghul resurrected him, and then this happened, and then that happened, and the other thing happened." It's like, no, 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 no. These aren't the things that we saw. These aren't the events that we kind of look at. So from that perspective, when I think of retcons, what I always think of is that example from Misery, where the character looks at this, gets annoyed, and goes, "Look, you can't change something that happened in the past because that's what retcons are." She wants it to continue on from that point. And I think that's a really helpful way, at least for me, to consider what retcons are and what we can allow them to consider. Okay, hopefully that's clear. We've just talked about twists and what twists are. We've talked about shocks and what shocks are and the difference between twists and shocks. And then we've talked about how people often think that twists are just retcons. In other words, they're just ways to slightly change or slightly fudge what has happened before to make it suit a new storyline. And I just argued that that's not the case. That retcons are kind of like a cheap thing that some writers do. And I've used that example of Misery to kind of highlight that, where someone might be jumping out of a car, the car explodes, and then in the next episode or issue, we realize that they did jump out of the car, we just didn't see it. That's not fair. There's no way for us as fans, as readers, as viewers to have seen that. So I'm not a fan of retcons. That brings us to retrospective recontextualization, which is the idea I want to talk about today. And it's important to realize that this idea is not the same as a retcon. What retrospective recontextualization is when you have various installments of something, be it issues of a comic, volumes of a novel series, or episodes in a TV show, and then you have something that happens, say, in the final movie or the final episode or something, that forces you to reconsider previous events. And actually, you realize that the previous events or previous things that have happened haven't happened in the way you thought they did or the reason that you thought they had. I'll give you some examples. Again, I'll use a rule of three here. So, for example, to give you some non-specific ones, Halo 4. As a game, in the fourth game of Halo, you suddenly start to find out all this stuff about this idiotic backstory they start to shoehorn in. They find out this whole thing that actually humans have been around for billions of years and used to own this like massive space empire and used to actually battle the Forerunners using spaceships and space weapons and stuff. Like that doesn't change any of the events of Halo 1, 2, and 3, but it does force you into some recontextualization of the events of those games. In that you can still play those games the same way, but now what you know is that there's some wider context, there's some wider stuff that's happened that changes how you feel about them, that changes how you think about them. In that sense, it's like a twist. You can't go through Halo again the same time, looking at it through the lens of the knowledge of Halo 4 without thinking, oh yeah, humans are on Halo, but the reason all Halo technology reacts to humans is because they are viewed as being like the Forerunners, and oh, this is the reason why, and all this. It's just it changes things. It forces you to look at it in a new context. Gears 4 is another good example. So this is the fourth installment of the Gears of War franchise. Gears 4 and Gears 5 both start putting together this kind of weird narrative that the Locusts were created by humans like 100 or so years prior. And it's some kind of human experimentation with the fuel emulsion that creates the Locust and the Locust Queen, etc., which is fine, although it's utterly idiotic because everything we see in the first few Gears of War games, it shows that the Locust civilization has been around for what seems to have been thousands of years. They have huge caverns, massive underground cities. There's an entire spectrum of biodiversity and Locust beasts and Locust weapons and things. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're meant to view this in the context of that they descended from humans in the last, like, what, 80 years? Feels like bullshit to me. So it does kind of weaken the franchise um, by viewing it in this new context. The final example I'm going to give is probably the worst example of this, and actually is the most obvious and clear-cut example, and that's Lion King 3, which is also sometimes billed as Lion King 1.5. And the reason it's called that is because Lion King 3, which is what I'm going to call it, is actually set at the same time as the events of Lion King 1 and 2. Um, and basically, it shows that there's like different key reasons for things that we thought happened in Lion Kings 1 and 2 didn't happen for the reasons that we thought they did. And it's like, oh, there you are. Here's a twist. This thing that we're going to tell you is going to change your viewing of the originals forever. The one that killed me, the one that absolutely has made this unwatchable for me and almost ruined Lion King for me, was the recontextualization of the opening scene of Lion King. In Lion King, and by that I mean Lion King 1, the original, the opening scene is the Circle of Life, sung by Elton John. It's got this brilliant panoramic bit of animation. It shows all the animals of the plains coming together to see the birth of Simba. And then when the monkey lifts Simba up into a shaft of sunlight, all the animals kneel. It's out of respect. It's a really powerful moment. It's great. It turns out in Lion King 3 that the reason they kneeled, or knelt rather, wasn't out of respect. It was because um, Pumbaa, whoever, the warthog, basically farted, and the fart smelt so bad that all the animals just kind of keeled over. Keep in mind, this is possibly canon, possibly not. But the important thing is this forces you, when you rewatch The Lion King, to have to actively ignore the events of Lion King 3. Otherwise, what it's doing is providing a new context and a new understanding of an event that otherwise worked really well, and is now showing you like a recontextualization of it, which makes The Lion King 1 just almost unwatchable. And it's terrible. It's a ridiculous idea. Um, but that's an idea of what retrospective recontextualization is. You could argue it's retconning, but like I say, a retcon is often tangibly changing something. So if Lion King had a retcon, they might have a retcon of, oh, actually, Simba wasn't born by himself. There were two, male cubs in that pack, and one of them died or went missing or got kidnapped or something. That would be a retcon. But we're not talking about a retcon here. What we're talking about is the moment where an event that we saw, all these animals kneeling, actually happened for a different reason. In this case, because Pumbaa breaks wind. These are all bad things, and I don't want to leave you with the idea that all retrospective recontextualization is a bad thing. Sometimes it can be done really well, and sometimes it can be done really well repeatedly. I think one of my early kind of interaction with Marvel Comics was with Ultimate Spider-Man, written by Brian Michael Bendis. I know Bendis is a divisive figure. I know his later work is largely maligned. I haven't read it, so I can't speak to that. What I can say is the Ultimate Spider-Man work, at least the first 150 issues or so, were exceptional. They were very clever. In fact, I'll probably do a video about that later anyway, because there's a lot I want to say about Ultimate Spider-Man. But what I will point out is that his work in this relied quite heavily and quite cleverly on retrospective recontextualization. There were many events where they would happen, and then 10, 15, 20 issues later, we'd suddenly have an issue that was a flashback to that event, looking at it from a different character's perspective, or looking at a series of unintended consequences to that event that we hadn't originally seen. One of my favorite issues of this was issue 70 something, where basically, long story short, one issue is Peter speaking to Green Goblin, and it's all the events of that. It's pretty standard, it's well written, it's well drawn, it's a great issue. And then a couple of issues later, we have the exact same events and the exact same conversation, but we have it from Green Goblin's perspective. And that's when you realize that he's insane. He's hearing all these other voices, there's speech bubbles all over the page, and the conversation he's having with Peter is not the conversation Peter's having with him. Green Goblin, or Norman Osborn, is speaking to random voices and just completely crazy, hearing and seeing totally different things. And this retrospective recontextualization is fantastic, because what it means is not only do you then realize that what you originally saw wasn't the full picture, when you go back and you read the prior issue, the issue which seems relatively standard from Peter's point of view, you're looking at it through an entirely new context, because you understand the context of what Green Goblin's going through in a way that you never had before. It's an excellent bit of retrospective recontextualization that adds depth and narrative and nuance to the original idea. So in some ways, this can be done well. Okay, I know there's a lot to take in, so let's have another quick recap. What we talked about is twist endings, which are endings that force you to review and rethink everything you've seen or read previously in a new context. And we talked about shock endings. And shock endings are endings which are just surprising. We've talked about how twist endings aren't the same as retcons because retcons are concrete changes that a writer does. So, for example, I gave the example of someone jumping out of a burning car just before it explodes, as opposed to vice versa. We see that a lot in comics. We see a lot of these kind of subtle writer, sort of lazy traits where you'll see someone in an explosion, and then in the next issue, it's like, oh, they actually weren't there. They jumped out off screen in a panel you hadn't seen. It's like, yeah, it's kind of cheap. But there's all these kind of subtle retcons, as well as the larger continuity retcons that we see with DC all the time about the origin of the Flash or the origin of Batman or the genesis of Superman and things like that. It's important to remember that retcons are not the same as retrospective recontextualization, which is what this video is really about. And this is the heart of it. Retrospective recontextualization is when something happens to show you that the events that we saw originally weren't the entire event. That there's another perspective, or that there's another agenda, or that there's another part to them. And once you understand the later thing, once you understand, for example, that in Halo 4 that actually all humans are part of an ancient spacefaring hyper advanced race, it does change the way that you view Halo 1, Halo 2, Halo 3 when you're playing those games, because you have this extra knowledge that's applied retrospectively but forces you to view all the events in a new context, hence retrospective recontextualization. Sometimes this is a bad thing, and from my point of view, when I play Gears of War 1 again, I do my very best to ignore the events of Gears of War 4 and 5 because I think they diminish the strength of the narrative. Similarly, I played Halo 4 and I played Halo 5, and I essentially ignore them because they damage the narrative of Halos 1 to 3. And the Lion King example speaks for itself. Having said that, there are some good examples of that, and I cited a few in Ultimate Spider-Man, and there are, other ones as well. If you look at something like Hoxpox, so House of X Powers of 10, one of the genius things about Hickman's reboot of the X-Men is that he just did it via retrospective recontextualization. He didn't wipe away any of the previous X-Men mythos, but what he did is he added this one single fundamental change, which is to do with Moira McTaggart, that forces all previous X-Men stories, literally every single one of them, since the 60s up until 2019, to be viewed through a new lens of this new context. And that's a phenomenal achievement. And I guess that experiment is still ongoing, so we'll see how that works out in the end. I hope that makes sense. I know it's kind of a complicated and abstract concept. The one thing that I just want to add at the end is just to say that not all sequels, even the crappy sequels, are actually retrospective recontextualization. Some of them are just rubbish sequels that don't really add anything of value. I've got some more examples here. Matrix 4 or Matrix Resurrections is a sequel that doesn't undo or change or provide a new context to any of the original three movies at all. It's just not very good. It's just more events that happen after the third movie that don't really provide any new context, that don't really offer a twist or a shock or try to do any retconning of any kind. It's just a sequel that's not very good. It's just more stuff. Independence Day 2 Resurgence is another example of this. There's nothing in Independence Day 2 Resurgence that forces you to reevaluate Independence Day 1, or that changes your viewing experience of Independence Day 1. There's no twist, there's no shock, there's definitely no retrospective context that changes the way that you view any of the events of Independence Day 1, but Independence Day 2 is just not a very good movie. Finally, Blade Runner 2049, which actually is quite a good movie. I'm not going to get into it now. Obviously, these are all my opinions, but what I will say is Blade Runner 2049, whilst it's a sequel that adds a lot to the Blade Runner lore, doesn't in any way change your viewing of the first Blade Runner movie. It doesn't change the context. It doesn't change your perspective on it from a retrospective idea. It doesn't retcon anything. It's just a sequel. So please don't think that all sequels provide retrospective recontextualization. Some of them are just sequels, as in groups of events that happen after the first group of events. All right. Hope that was helpful. I know it's a bit technical. And I don't know if these deep dives are really very interesting, but I just thought this random thoughts thing would be kind of useful for me just to kind of vent my thoughts and just kind of clarify some stuff I think about when I think about comics. As you can tell, I think about comics quite a lot in an abstract academic way. Um, so hopefully this was interesting. Yeah, as always, everything contained in these videos are just my own random opinions. Feel free to disagree. I don't really expect anyone to agree with me, but maybe it's give you something to ponder about. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, stay classy. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.